Salvatore Babones is an associate professor at the University of Sydney and the founder of the India Century Roundtable, an Australian think tank which focuses on Indian democracy and its liberal institutions. Welcome to you, Professor Babones.
Pleasure to talk to you.
So Fair Observer has managed to grab a moment here with Professor Babones while he visits London, and it's a beautiful sunny day today, and here we are in the heart of Westminster. Welcome to London.
Thank you very much.
So we're going to focus a little bit on these democracy indices, which you've criticised quite a lot. So let's think back to last year. Last year you actually became quite a hero in India after you criticised the democracy indices by Freedom House, the V-Dem Institute and the Economist Intelligence Unit. We'll go through all of those in detail, but first of all, perhaps you can just give us a general overview of your arguments.
There are three major democracy indices. They range from the most objective, the Rise of Democracy Institute rankings, through Freedom House, to the most subjective, the Economist rankings. And ironically, it's the most subjective rankings that rate India the best, which we should get into. The most objective rankings, the V-Dem rankings, rate it the worst. But these rankings are very much driven, I think, by politics and by people's own political views.
Sweden's V-Dem Institute was bad for India last year, but frankly it's even worse this year. India's plummeted in the electoral democracy index from 93rd to, as you said, 108th in the world. So that's below countries like Tanzania, Bolivia, Mexico, Singapore and Nigeria. What's your issue with their methodology?
There are very serious problems with V-Dem's methodology. V-Dem is composed of 5 sub-indices of democracy. 2 are supposedly objective, 3 are subjective. Now, the objective indicators in V-Dem, whether or not you have elections and whether or not you have universal suffrage, virtually every country in the world gets a perfect score for those, including Vietnam, for example, which has a single-party Communist Party state. And they get a perfect score because they're purely looking at the Constitution. So does the Constitution say that officials are elected? Does the Constitution say that everyone can vote? And if so, you get a perfect score. So right away, countries that are not democracies at all are starting with the same perfect score as a country like India, which is a bona fide democracy. The differentiation in V-Dem comes from its more subjective indicators. Now, even when we get to those, we're asking experts, or V-Dem is asking experts, to evaluate things that really don't necessarily have to do with democracy. So, for example, on free and fair elections, Hong Kong is rated to have freer and fair elections than India. Why? Because although it sounds good, I mean, does a country have free and fair elections? We want to know. When you look at the actual questions on V-Dem, the questions are things like, is there any violence at the polls? Well, yes, in India every year there's violence at the polls. In Hong Kong, no, it's an orderly state. It's a rich, orderly little country that, or unit that has a very high level of public security. Are there complaints to the Electoral Commission? Well, in Hong Kong, no. Why would you complain? It's a Communist Party run area, right? So we have these same problems. Vietnam, the same thing. Vietnam is rated on a par with India for free and fair elections, despite the fact that there's only one party in Vietnam. That doesn't seem to matter for V-Dem. What matters is the formal process in Vietnam goes off without a hitch. Is the electoral roll complete? Again, in India, there are questions about the electoral roll. Are recent immigrants from Bangladesh citizens of India, or are they illegal immigrants? It's not clear. Well, in Hong Kong, yes, there's an absolutely complete electoral roll. Now, what V-Dem should be asking is, can you realistically unseat the government? Can you oppose the government? Okay. Could someone else win an election? Are there barriers to someone else winning an election? Those are really what democracy is about. Those questions aren't even in V-Dem. So in effect, India is being downgraded for questions about process when autocratic regimes, entirely non-democracies, are scoring better.
Right. But there are also some conclusions in their reports, which are, for example, that India was one of the top 10 autocratizing countries in the world. I'm not even sure if that's a word.
It is now.
It is now, okay. So isn't it true that we are seeing this centralization of power under Modi to a greater extent now than we ever have in the past?
No, look, this is an artifact of what we call the charisma of statistics, in that V-Dem has set a series of score points on its indices. If you're below this score, you're an autocracy. Now, they're not doing a deep evaluation of India's governance standards. They're simply asking, is your score below I don't remember the exact number. Is it below 0.6? Is it below 0.4? You know, below this point, you become an autocracy. Below this point, you become... Okay, so they're simply saying that India's score on VDEM has declined. Now, they're interpreting that in words as an increasing autocratization in India without doing any actual analysis of governance procedures in India. Again, if you go to the report itself, what is used to support that argument that India is increasingly autocratizing? And the answer is, well, India's VDEM score has declined.
One quick point, though, on that is that even the RSS, which is aligned obviously to the BJP, has said that the Indian Administrative Service has too much power now. So isn't that criticism coming from those who are, in theory, aligned with the government? Oh,
there's a legitimate debate all around the world of presidential versus cabinet systems, of consensus government versus winner-take-all systems. We see that debate not just in India, but in lots of other countries as well. But that debate is not embedded in the actual VDEM rankings. There are no questions in VDEM, as far as I'm aware, asking, is government consensual or is government centralized? Because we accept that both centralized and consensual systems are both forms of democratic governance. So yes, there may be these complaints in India. On the other hand, other people may complain that administration in India is inefficient and too decentralized. I mean, there are various points of view on whether administration should be centralized or decentralized. But that's not something unique to India. And I stress, that is not the reason for the declining ranking on VDEM. The declining ranking on VDEM is driven entirely by declining scores on specific questions asked of Indian political scientists by the V-Dem Institute. And those scores on particular questions, I think, in some cases are probably biased. That is, the people they're asking have a bias against the current government and thus see it in a way, they see the Electoral Commission as being less independent because Modi won, right? And to some extent, those questions are simply methodologically poorly constructed. Is a free and fair election really one in which the electoral roll is complete and there's no violence in the polls? Or is a free and fair election one in which you can oppose the government? VDEM says the former. I think the latter is a much more intuitive understanding.
Just a couple of quick points on that, though. There are complaints by those in India that there's a centralization of power, not just at a Prime Minister's office level, but also at a state level.
Sure.
With Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal and MK Stalin in Tamil Nadu. Isn't that a trend that you can see? It's not just something that's been twisted in the stats, it's something that actually people on the ground are seeing.
Oh, I think there is a trend in India towards more centralized governance, and I don't see that that's in any way anti-democratic. That is, democracy theory really says nothing on this, and I don't see that it is necessarily even bad, in that India is a poor developing country with a lack of administrative talent, and when things get brought into the Prime Minister's office, they get done. When things are left to the broader bureaucracy, often they don't get done. So it's a recipe for making sure that promises made by politicians actually get enacted. Now, I know many people will feel that their ideal of democracy is a decentralized democracy where everything is local, until their local authority makes a decision that they think is, reprehensible or against human rights, and then they want things to come from above.
Well, one word we haven't mentioned so far is corruption.
Sure.
And Transparency International actually ranks India 85th in the world for corruption. It says that the country's scores remain stagnant, so it hasn't worsened as it has with perhaps other things. But some of the mechanisms that could help rein in corruption are weakening. Do you dispute that finding?
India is relatively clean from the standpoint of a developing country. Remember, 85th in the world, despite being much poorer than 85th in the world. It is relatively corrupt compared to Western Europe or North American countries. Now, that's just a fact. Corruption is not worsening by any account. And by most accounts, and this is anecdotal accounts, I can't vouch for these in any kind of data-driven way, the Modi government has made anti-corruption a serious effort. And the one thing we do know where corruption has been dramatically reduced is in the provision, the most important area, not licensing for 5G telecom, defense procurement. The most important thing of all, service delivery to the poor. We know that moving to direct benefit transfers, which has been a key policy achievement of the Modi government, has cut out all the middlemen who were previously taking part of the cash that was supposed to be going to poor people. Poor people now receive their full benefits instead of having to face corruption at every stage. So that's a big win against corruption. What is the true level of corruption in India? I can't tell you. Surveys can't tell you. Transparency International almost entirely surveys large businesses, so there are big business perceptions of corruption. We don't even have any proper indices of ordinary people's perceptions of corruption. We don't know how corrupt India is. If I had to guess, they're doing a good job for a country of $2,200 GDP per capita.
So lack of data might explain, for example, why The Economist relies so much on experts for its findings. They, in 2022, described India as a flawed democracy and downgraded it 2 places to 53rd position. What's your view on their rankings?
First, flawed democracy, quote unquote, partially free, to use the Freedom House terminology. I remind people that's not a value judgment, that's a score judgment. If you fall below a certain score on their index, they have a range that is democracy, a range that is flawed democracy, a range that is non-democracy. Same thing with Freedom House, a range that is free, a range that is partly free, a range that is unfree. That's not a judgment that it's suddenly become flawed where it wasn't flawed before. All democracies are flawed democracies. The Economist has now rated India, downgraded India for the last few years. That's the opinion of their editorial team, that India's democracy is no longer as good as it was. But I strongly suspect that that opinion is shaped by the press coverage they see coming out of India, by the NGO reports they see coming out of India. It's not driven by a deep expertise on India. I remind everyone, The Economist is not ranking India. The Economist is ranking 170 countries. Right? Freedom House, the same thing. V-Dem, the same thing. These are not India rankings. These are broad global rankings. They don't show, and The Economist of all the 3 of these has the least country expertise embedded in its rankings. Ironically, it produces the best ranking for India. V-Dem, which relies almost solely, or over 85%, they say in their materials, on in-country experts, rates India the worst. So, grain of salt, take it whatever way you want, but it's certainly not, it's not very meaningful to say that India has gone from being free to partly free, from being a full democracy to a flawed democracy. All that represents is a declining score on their index.
Now, let's look at the Freedom House reports, because that focuses particularly on...
it's not actually a democracy report, it is actually a rights report.
That's right, yeah. So now Freedom House downgraded India from free to partially free in 2022, and it maintains that view this year. It said the report said that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Hindu nationalist BJP have presided over discriminatory policies and a rise in persecution affecting the Muslim population. Are they wrong?
Oh, I think they are wrong, and I think we have some good data that they're wrong. But they are picking up on a number of policies that are, have been portrayed by NGOs as being anti-Muslim or being transgressions of rights, which in fact, I think if you look at them carefully, that is that's an NGO interpretation being based on it. I'm sorry, an NGO interpretation that is being spun from those policies. I mean, the most clear example, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is cited by Freedom House in its report. The CAA is an act that gives a pathway to citizenship for people who are members of persecuted religious minorities fleeing Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Officially, Sharia law, Muslim, not only Muslim majority countries, but officially Muslim countries that have historically persecuted people of other religions. Now, what the CAA says is that if you're a Muslim refugee from Afghanistan, you are not automatically granted refugee status. You have to apply for refugee status. If you're Sikh, if you're Hindu, automatic.
Fine. Because
of your religion, you're considered a legitimate refugee. If you're Muslim, you have to show persecution. Now, I think that's an unnecessarily strict construction of refugee status. I think there could have been more leeway in it. For example, Ahmadi Muslims are persecuted in Pakistan, even though Pakistan is an officially Muslim country. Allowing anyone who's persecuted on the behalf of religion would probably have been a more generous and better drafted way to write the law. But instead of saying anyone who's persecuted on the basis of religion, the law actually lists a series of religions. Now, that's poor drafting. It's not a perfect law, but it's a very liberal law.
I think this is one aspect, but if you look at what Human Rights Watch, for example, is saying about India, they talk about summary punishments, they talk about shops and homes being demolished, excessive force, floggings, public floggings.
Yeah.
So these are actual things happening to Muslims in India. We're not just talking about whether they accept Muslims from neighboring countries.
These things have occurred as incidents in India, and they have been investigated, and they're subject to litigation in India. And that's the key point. I mean, if I tell you, again, sorry to pick on New Zealand, but we all respect New Zealand. We all think it's a wonderful democracy. It's rated in the top 5 in, I think, all the major democracy rankings. Well, if I told you that the largest mass killing of Muslims in the last 5 years occurred in New Zealand, oh, are you serious? Like, more Muslims have been killed in terrorist attacks in New Zealand than in India in the last 5 years? And we think, oh, that's right, the 2019 Christchurch massacre. You know, we forget about it because we think, oh, New Zealand's a good country. Now, if 200 Muslims had been killed in a terrorist attack in India for being Muslim, we would never hear the end of it because we have a preconception that India is anti-Muslim. Now, with New Zealand, we trust that the perpetrators are going to be tracked down, that these are going to be redressed, that there's going to be a national, and there was a national outpouring of sympathy for the community that was attacked. And really, that's what we should be looking for in India. And we can't ask, has any police person in India ever transgressed the rights of a Muslim? Yeah, the answer is yes. As the answer is yes in England, in the United States, in New Zealand, in every country in the world.
I suppose the question is whether that's worsened.
The question is what happens.
Premiership.
Well, no, the question is what happens to the person who does it. So, for example, in India, you mentioned the case of the whipping of the Muslim man who was then tied to a pole and whipped by police. Those police officers were promptly arrested. Now, I don't know the exact progress of the cases, but they were arrested, they were dismissed, they're facing legal action, and that's what we really need to look to. I mean, India is a country that has a GDP per capita on a par with sub-Saharan Africa, where these sorts of social, we shouldn't be expecting that India has a level of education and civility that is similar to a well-settled country with 30 times its GDP per capita. So the question for India is not, do things happen that are wrong? They happen in New Zealand, they happen in the UK. We could point to the Leicester attacks, Leicester violence in the UK. These things happen everywhere. The question is, in a robust, well-institutionalized democracy, does the machinery of government respond appropriately? And I think in India the answer is largely, and I stress largely, yes.
Just tell me why you think these rankings matter.
They matter for many reasons. First, they matter because they matter for international affairs. Narendra Modi just visited the United States. There is a willingness in the United States to work with India because of a perception that it is a growing economy and an important country. But the American establishment is, in effect, holding its nose when it works with India. All of the statements, if you look at them, from Jake Sullivan, from Representative McCarthy, they're all along the lines of, well, we know India has problems, but we want to work with them anyway. Instead of saying, actually, these accounts of problems in India are wildly exaggerated. And we saw Barack Obama recently give a very controversial interview in which he said that India had to address these problems or it might soon face a second partition of India. Now, this affects how the United States works with India, whether it works with India as a true partner or simply as a customer, someone who might buy defense equipment. More broadly, it enters into things like how much India pays for its international bonds, right? All bond
there are real world effects.
Oh yeah, bonds are all benchmarked to the sovereign bond rate, and the sovereign bond rate for India is partly benchmarked to governance standards, and those governance standards in large part come from the V-Dem survey, which then enter into World Bank and USAID governance standards. So there are indirect but real effects.
Yeah.
More broadly, there's just also the matter of simple justice. I mean, I'm an academic. I'm not a spokesperson for India.
Well, you say you're not a spokesperson.
I am not a spokesperson. I've received no money.
But on Twitter, you obviously are making no secret of your support for India. You're wearing a Make India Great Again cap.
Yes,
and you're raising money for an Indian think tank.
Raising money for a think tank, any think tank has to raise money. And that's just a fact of life. Any reporting organization has to earn money. We have to earn money to do things. Now, that money's not going to me. I must stress, everything I've done for the Indian Century Roundtable has been pro bono. My Make India Great Again hat is a joke. If you watch my Twitter, I'm very much a humorist on Twitter. And in fact, I write a humor column for an Australian journal, Quadrant. I enjoy being a humorist on Twitter, but that humor is on Twitter. The humor is not in my academic writing.
Are you worried, though, about your perceived objectivity when, for example, you met
of course I met Narendra Modi
last month, and you exchanged some comments on Twitter where you were, very proud to have met him.
Yeah, of course I am. I think that's a perfectly normal human thing to do. Look, I am not an arbiter. I'm not a judge. I'm not a journalist. I'm a person and an academic who's writing what he believes, and I also have a personal life. Now, if I had a responsibility to defend India, I would probably be much more guarded about things I say personally on Twitter. I am not the guardian of India. I'm not the defender of India. I'm an academic who has a viewpoint. You can take my viewpoint or leave it, but the point is what I'm bringing to the table is factual data about India. We haven't gotten into any of those facts today in this interview. I can give you lots of survey data about India. I can give you lots of factual data about India. Now, whether or not people like me or like what hat I wear, the factual data are the factual data. And I get people almost always coming back with ad hominem attacks. If I write something, that is exculpatory about Narendra Modi's India, someone will say, "Oh, he's a Trump supporter." well, first of all, whether or not I am a Trump supporter, and I've never taken any public opinion on that, or public position on that, is irrelevant to whether the facts about India are true or not. I mean, the Committee to Protect Journalists data on journalist deaths are the same data, whatever you think of me personally. The data we have on attitudes of Muslims in India, that is Muslims' self-reported experiences of discrimination in India, are the same, whatever you think of me. I'd like to talk about the data, not so much about myself.
Well, that leads us on to your think tank. Tell us a bit more about what that's aiming to achieve.
Well, the Indian Century Roundtable, it's something I've tried to get started up in Australia. As I should stress, an Australian think tank, and the goal is to present a factual narrative about India. Our launch report was my report about the V-Dem rankings. And again, it's not a report that just complains that the V-Dem rankings are unfair to India. It's a technical analysis of V-Dem. My own background is as a social statistician. I teach our statistics curriculum at the University of Sydney. And my major academic work is Methods for Quantitative Macro-Comparative Research, which is a book about statistics used for international comparison. So this is exactly my own area of academic expertise. We're also looking to commission papers on other controversial issues in India just to try to get a factual account. And when I commission those papers, again, we're going to experts who have knowledge on the subject. We're not trying to give a policy recommendation for India. Instead, we're simply trying to get a factual account of India. Our next paper will be on the Aadhaar system, which is the National Identification Number system. Right now, if you go for information in the West, all you can get is either glorifying articles from the business press about how wonderful it is everyone has a bank account, or condemnatory articles from the NGO press saying that this is a system for cataloging people to prime them for repression. Well, we'd like to get a factual account. Well, how does the Aadhaar system work? We're commissioning a paper on the collegium system for appointing judges. Same thing. India has a very distinctive system. The closest parallel is Israel, pre-Netanyahu reforms for appointing judges. Judges essentially appoint themselves in India's judiciary. Well, does that ensure judicial independence, or is that a recipe for nepotism? We've commissioned a report from a senior barrister, an Australian barrister, to just take an objective look at the system. I have no position on these things. I mean, this makes it seem hard to believe. I'm not Indian, I'm not Hindu, I'm not getting any money from this. I'm doing this because I'm looking at the data and saying the data are completely at odds with the narrative. And then when you get deeper into the narrative is motivated by highly political people who are pushing the narrative. And then reporters, and forgive me, I mean, it's not nice to criticize the third estate, but reporters who, instead of going to the data, just repeat via quotes. Well, this NGO person said this NGO person said that, without asking the hard questions of them. Well, wait a minute. Why are you saying that? Is that true? I mean, the simplest thing that I keep going back to, Committee to Protect Journalists tells everyone that journalists are in danger in India because more journalists are killed in India over time than in any other country outside China. And you think, oh, that's terrible. Well, no reporter, as far as I can tell, has ever asked the Committee to Protect Journalists, have you adjusted for population size? Now, it doesn't take a social statistician who writes books on statistics to just ask that simple question. Yeah, more people have black hair in India than in any country outside China. You know, tell me what the stats are. And I'd like to see the third estate not only holding me to account, I'm happy with that, but holding NGOs to account, holding politicians to account, going to the data. That's what the Indian Century Roundtable is all about. It's all about going to the data.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. I think we'll have to leave it there. Fair Observer is a platform for citizen journalism with over 2,500 contributors from over 90 different countries, and we would love you to join the conversation. So if today's discussion has prompted any thoughts, do get in touch. You can follow us on social media, you can write for us at Fair Observer, and of course you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.